Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a clash that shaped the future of the Indian subcontinent and exposed the dangerous fusion of profit, power, and imperial ambition. The Anglo-Sikh Wars weren't just about land or borders. They were about control, military, political, and economic, and the ripple effects of centralized authority meeting an empire trying to hold itself together. So here's the big question. What happens when a rising indigenous power collides with a colonial machine that's not even pretending to play fair? Let's set the stage. On one side, we have the Sikh Empire. Under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, this wasn't just a kingdom with swords and rituals, it was a full-blown modernized military state. Ranjit Singh created a centralized system, uniting the fractured regions of Punjab under a single command. He didn't just adopt European military technology, he invited European officers to train his troops. We're talking disciplined infantry, modern artillery, and strategic fortifications that rivaled the best European armies of the time. This was no backward kingdom, it was a power player. And on the other side, not a traditional nation-state, but a private company, the British East India Company. Think about that for a second, a company with its own army, its own navy, its own tax system. It was capitalism with cannons. The company operated like a modern multinational corporation, but with the power to invade, occupy, and annex territory. Its goal wasn't governance, it was profit. And Punjab was a tantalizing prize. Then came 1839. Ranjit Singh dies, and with him, the glue holding the Sikh Empire together. What followed was classic internal collapse. Infighting, factionalism, assassinations, competing generals, weak successors, and court intrigue. The once cohesive empire began to fray at the edges. And the British? They saw opportunity. Fueled by anxiety over the possibility of a powerful northern Indian rival, British officials began tightening the screws. They increased pressure on Sikh leadership, shifted troops toward the border, and pushed policies designed to provoke instability. Whether through diplomacy or intimidation, the British were angling for control, and they didn't plan to wait long. What we have here is a perfect storm, a centralized but weakening indigenous empire facing off against a profit-hungry corporate war machine. The question was never if they'd clash, it was only when, and that moment came sooner than anyone expected. Now let's move to the First War, and the brutal reality that followed. The year is 1845, and tensions are ready to explode. The British East India Company had crept dangerously close to the Sutlej River, right on the border of Sikh territory. And the Sikh military leadership? They saw exactly what was happening. These weren't passive maneuvers. The British were sending a message. But here's the trick, they didn't fire the first shot. Instead, they let fear do the work for them. Sikh commanders, rightly alarmed by British movements and intentions, responded. They mobilized. They crossed the river. And just like that, the First Anglo-Sikh War was on. What followed was anything but a swift campaign. This was not a one-sided affair. At battles like Mudki, Ferozeshah, and Sabrain, the Sikh army showed remarkable skill and tenacity. These weren't scattered rebels. They were trained, disciplined soldiers, many of them veterans of Ranjit Singh's military machine. And the casualties? They were staggering. Both sides bled heavily. British forces, despite superior logistics, faced brutal resistance. And yet, something began to shift. Why? Not because the British were stronger, but because they were more coordinated, and the Sikh Empire was already unraveling from the inside. Political infighting, inconsistent leadership, and lingering instability from Ranjit Singh's death meant that Sikh unity couldn't hold. The British, ever the tacticians, exploited this weakness ruthlessly. They used internal division like a weapon. In the end, it wasn't just bullets that won the war, it was strategy, deception, and timing. The final blow came in the form of the Treaty of Lahore. On paper, it was just a peace agreement. In reality, it was economic strangulation. The Sikhs were forced to give up territory, surrender key fortresses, disarm significant parts of their military, and hand over an enormous financial indemnity that gutted their treasury. The British didn't just win, they made sure the Sikh Empire would never pose the same threat again. But make no mistake, this wasn't peace. It was the pause before the final act. Let's move on to what happened between the wars, and how the British didn't need soldiers to continue their conquest. So the guns go quiet, the treaties are signed, but the war? The war doesn't really end, it just changes shape. Welcome to the age of empire by paper, where policies replaced cannons, and conquest was carried out in courtrooms and treasuries instead of battlefields. After the First Anglo-Sikh War, the British didn't just walk away. They knew that Punjab, even weakened, still held strategic value and resistance potential, so they got to work, not with generals this time, but with governors, accountants, and political agents. Step 1. Puppet leadership. They placed young Duleep Singh, a child, on the throne, a boy king, symbolic, powerless. Real authority was held by British officials operating behind the curtain. Duleep wore the crown, but the East India Company held the reins. It was a monarchy on paper, and a colony in practice. Then came the economic assault. Under the terms of the Treaty of Lahore and the daily costs of colonial administration, Punjab's treasury was drained. Indemnities, taxes, fees, payments for British troops stationed inside the region. The wealth that once funded one of Asia's most modern armies was now redirected to London's balance sheets. Infrastructure suffered, economic stability crumbled, and the people, they paid the price. But the most dangerous weapon of all wasn't military or economic. It was political manipulation. The British deliberately inflamed internal rivalries, supporting one faction here, undermining another there. They turned the Sikh court into a game board. Divide and rule wasn't just a theory, it was an operating manual. Through surveillance, co-option, and clever positioning, they weakened what was left of Sikh central authority without ever needing to fire another shot. What you're seeing here is something far more insidious than a traditional war. This is conquest by design, where every move is calculated, every policy aimed at destabilizing the enemy from within. And yet, for all their cleverness, the British underestimated one thing. People don't forget. And the fires of rebellion? They were still smoldering beneath the surface. Next, we'll see what happens when those embers reignite, in a second war that would seal the fate of the Sikh Empire. By 1848, the cracks had widened. The British may have installed their puppet king, drained the economy, and manipulated the politics, but control built on resentment is always temporary. And in Multan, it all came crashing down. It started with a spark, British officials disrespecting and mishandling local leaders. But like any tightly wound system under pressure, it didn't take much to trigger the explosion. The rebellion in Multan quickly escalated, sweeping across Punjab like wildfire. The people had had enough. What followed wasn't chaos, it was organized, determined resistance. The Sikh military forces, though fractured and diminished, still possessed deep wells of martial discipline. The uprising soon evolved into full-scale warfare. British forces now found themselves confronting a renewed and fierce opposition in battles across Ramnagar, Chilianwala, and Gujarat. And these weren't skirmishes. They were brutal, high-casualty engagements that tested British strength and resolve. Chilianwala in particular was a bloodbath. The British suffered enormous losses. Officers and soldiers alike were stunned by the tenacity of their opponents. It was a reminder, Punjab was not conquered yet. But the outcome was never just about who could fight harder. It was about who had more resources, more coordination, and, frankly, more time to bleed. The British eventually broke through. Their forces regrouped, reorganized, and overwhelmed the scattered Sikh resistance. The cost was high, but by the time the dust settled, it was over. In 1849, the British declared total victory. They formally annexed Punjab. Sikh sovereignty, which had stood as a regional power for decades, was erased with the stroke of a pen. The empire was gone, but what replaced it wasn't just British rule. It was something deeper, a transformation of political identity, cultural memory, and economic destiny. The Second Anglo-Sikh War marked the end of one era and the total imposition of another. But as we'll see next, the war may have ended on the battlefield, but the true cost of conquest was just beginning to reveal itself. Victory, they say, comes with spoils. But for the British, conquest was never just about flags or maps. It was about systems, about reshaping societies from the top down into something profitable, predictable, and subservient. After annexing Punjab, the British set out to restructure everything. They brought in new laws, new administrators, and a new economy, built in their own image. But here's the thing, when you impose control from above, when your only goal is to extract value, there are always consequences. And they're never just economic. First came the profit machine. British land policies transformed agriculture from a local livelihood into a colonial revenue source. Land was taxed aggressively. Crops were often dictated by what London needed, not what local communities depended on. The fertile plains of Punjab, once feeding its own people, now fed foreign markets. This wasn't development, it was extraction. Then came the legal and cultural overhauls. British courts replaced local justice systems. English replaced Persian in administration. The Sikh aristocracy was dismantled. Temples and religious institutions lost influence. And what replaced them? A distant, foreign bureaucracy, more concerned with spreadsheets and efficiency than with culture or tradition. And always, there was surveillance. From informants in villages to intelligence reports sent straight to London, the British kept a watchful eye on every sign of dissent. They didn't just conquer the land, they tried to conquer the mind. But perhaps the most lasting damage was spiritual. The Sikh people, once autonomous, proud, and unified under their own flag, were now subjects of a foreign crown. Their symbols of identity were preserved, but stripped of political power. Heritage became memory, and memory became resistance. This is the hidden cost of imperial ambition. It's not just lost battles, it's lost potential. What could Punjab have become if it had remained independent? If decentralized governance had been allowed to flourish? If trade and diplomacy, not force, had been the tools of engagement? That's what we'll explore next, as we consider not just what happened, but what might have been. Now pause for a moment. Let's imagine a different path. One where empires didn't march on each other for dominance, but worked alongside one another with mutual respect. One where cultures clashed and collaborated, not collapsed under the weight of conquest. Because here's the truth, it didn't have to end this way. The Sikh Empire was not a backwards relic doomed to fall. It was a functioning system with its own logic, one that blended spiritual leadership, military strength, and regional unity. It had already proven it could modernize, adopt new technologies, and maintain religious pluralism. There was a real chance, however slim, that it could have become a model for decentralized governance in a colonial world. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. The British didn't just defeat the Sikh Empire militarily, they denied it the chance to evolve on its own terms. What if trade routes had opened instead of battlefields? What if cultural diplomacy replaced military occupation? What if empire wasn't the only way to engage with the world? Imagine a federated India made up of strong, cooperative states, each managing their own affairs, trading freely, and choosing their own destinies. A system where competition wasn't eliminated, but kept in balance. Where economic and cultural diversity was embraced, not erased. Of course, that's not the story we got. Instead, we got a world shaped by centralized control, where massive bureaucracies replaced local knowledge, and where distant rulers decided the fates of people they would never meet. But history isn't just about what happened. It's about the possibilities that were lost. And when we ask what could have been, we also begin to ask, what can still be? Now, let's bring it all together with some final reflections on the legacy of this conflict and why the story still matters today. What does it take to lose a nation? Sometimes, all it takes is one death, one vacuum of leadership, one crack in the foundation. But more often, it's a slow erosion. Policies that chip away at sovereignty, treaties that bind rather than protect, and systems designed to control rather than uplift. The fall of the Sikh Empire wasn't inevitable. It was engineered, and yet, its memory refuses to disappear. To this day, the story of the Anglo-Sikh Wars lives on, not just in textbooks or archives, but in the identity of a people who remember what it meant to fight for their own future. It's a reminder that freedom is fragile, that power, once centralized, rarely gives itself back, and that every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually meets the consequences of its own ambition. History isn't just about the past, it's a mirror, and if we look closely, we can see the same forces at play today. Economic manipulation, foreign control masked as partnership, and centralized systems that erode local power one signature at a time. But we can also see something else: the resilience of memory, the strength of culture, and the unbreakable desire to be free. Thank you for watching Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. If you found this video insightful, thought-provoking, or even just eye-opening, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps us keep uncovering the truths buried beneath the official version of history. And if you want to dive deeper, check out the podcast version of this episode using the link in the description. We've got plenty more stories waiting to be told, so if you enjoy history with depth, personality, and bold questions, stick around. We'll see you in the next one.